I was never a night owl, but on November 22nd, 1987, I found myself awake past midnight, flipping through the channels of my old television. The city outside was quiet, just the hum of distant traffic and the occasional horn. WGN Channel 9 was airing the nightly news. Nothing unusual, until it was. Just as the sports segment started, the screen flickered. The picture distorted into jagged, glitching lines. Then the newscaster vanished, and in his place, a man appeared, wearing a rubber Max Headroom mask. The image was grainy, the background spinning like a cheap metallic panel, swaying back and forth as if on strings. The masked figure wobbled, moving erratically, almost like a puppet controlled by invisible hands. No station watermark, no graphics, just this thing. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, maybe an experimental commercial. But then the voice kicked in. Warped, robotic, laced with static. "This is Max Headroom," the figure declared in a mocking, sing-song voice. It was like hearing a transmission from something that shouldn't exist. I sat there, frozen. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The figure laughed, but the sound was distorted, stretched into something unnatural. He started spouting nonsense, cryptic phrases that made no sense, mocking the station, mocking the government, mocking something unseen. Every few seconds, the screen rippled, like a corrupted VHS tape being chewed up by the player. My stomach twisted as he began humming a tune, rocking back and forth. Oh, I just made a giant masterpiece. Then he stopped, his head jerked toward the camera. The mask was hideous up close, its frozen, exaggerated grin unnerving in the dim glow of my screen. "Catch the wave!" he screeched, and the speakers crackled. Suddenly, the screen cut to black. My hands were shaking. But before I could process what happened, the broadcast resumed. The news anchor reappeared, confused, staring at the camera. It was like nothing had happened. No one mentioned the interruption. No breaking news. No explanation. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The next day, the newspapers reported it. A pirate signal intrusion. The FCC called it a federal offense, but no one knew who was behind it. They said it was some underground prankster, a hacker playing a joke. But it didn't feel like a joke. That night, I kept my TV off. Something about the way that thing looked at the camera, it felt like it was looking at me. A few nights later, another intrusion happened on a different channel, WTTW. This time, it was worse. The figure returned, except now, he was screaming. His voice was raw, filled with garbled static. He held up a glove, claimed it was a present, then shrieked in laughter. Then the screen cut to something else, something even worse. A distorted, writhing image. A body, maybe. A person? But before I could make sense of it, the screen turned black. That was the last time anyone ever saw the Max Headroom intruder. The FCC launched an investigation, but they never found him. No fingerprints, no traces, just a faceless broadcast that came from nowhere and disappeared into the airwaves. To this day, I still think about it. Who was he? What was the message? Was it just a prank or something more sinister? And the worst part? Sometimes in the middle of the night, my TV flickers for just a second, static filling the screen before returning to normal. Maybe it's nothing, just interference. Or maybe he's still out there.
I had been working the overnight shift at WKCR, Columbia University's radio station, for almost 2 years. The late hours didn't bother me anymore. There was something peaceful about the quiet hum of equipment, the dim glow of the studio lights, and the occasional rustling of notes as I prepped the next set list. It was past 3 a.m. on a cold October night when it happened. I was alone in the control room, playing a scheduled jazz segment. The smooth, lazy notes filled the studio, a stark contrast to the eerie silence beyond these walls. That's when the feed cut. At first, I thought it was a transmitter issue, just dead air. But then, something else came through. A low, warbling sound. Like a voice, except it was layered, echoing, distorting itself in unnatural ways. The volume rose and fell, and behind the garbled speech was something even more unsettling. A soft, rhythmic tapping. My fingers hovered over the controls, heart pounding. The voice was unintelligible, but I could pick out words here and there. Help, accident, no time, they are coming. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The voice continued, frantic now. Can you hear me? This is the last transmission. I don't know where I am. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was in the room. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Just the dull glow of the equipment. The voice crackled, warping into a static howl before the jazz music suddenly resumed, as if nothing had happened. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to comprehend what I had just heard. Had the station picked up a rogue signal? An old transmission bleeding through? My hands trembled as I reached for the phone to call my supervisor, but then the line went dead. The music played on, unbothered by my panic. And then, just as I was about to leave, something whispered through the speakers, so faint I almost missed it. "I see you." The next morning, I reviewed the logs. No interruption, no anomalies, just a regular jazz segment, uninterrupted. I asked the other engineers. No one had touched the equipment that night. No one had reported any interference. If it had been a pirate signal, there should have been traces, logs of disruptions and unauthorized frequency shift, but there was nothing. For weeks, I avoided night shifts, but the curiosity clawed at me. Eventually, I gathered the nerve to listen to the station's tape archives for that night. There was no recording. The tape jumped from one song to the next as if an entire section had been erased. That night, I forced myself to stay until dawn, hoping to catch something, anything that could explain what had happened. I set up a personal recorder separate from the station's system, just to be sure. Hours passed. The studio was silent except for the occasional crackle of static. My eyelids were growing heavy when I heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "I see you." The signal was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the jazz, but it was there. I turned up the volume and held my breath. Then came a new sound, one I hadn't heard before. It was breathing. Slow, ragged breathing right next to the microphone. I checked the studio cameras. Empty. I should have left. I should have turned everything off and walked out the door. But something compelled me to stay. I watched the signal monitor, waiting, hoping for a rational explanation. And then, the voice returned. "Don't look outside." My heart slammed against my ribs. The message repeated, warping and twisting. I turned, my gaze drawn to the control room's small window. There was a figure standing just beyond the glass. A shadowed shape, featureless, still. I bolted upright, nearly knocking over the console. My mind raced. No one should have been in the building at this hour. I swallowed hard and stepped toward the window. It was gone. The whisper came again, a final warning, barely audible beneath the returning jazz track. Too late. The next morning, I submitted my resignation. I still tell myself it was a glitch, that maybe I dozed off and imagined the whole thing. But every so often, when I'm alone at night, I'll turn on the radio. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear that same distorted voice whispering from the static, "I see you."
I had lived in Casper, Wyoming my entire life, and nothing ever happened here. The town was quiet, predictable, and mostly unremarkable until one night in 2006. It was late, past 1 a.m., and I was flipping through local television channels, searching for something to watch. The usual programming was on, infomercials, reruns of sitcoms, weather updates. But then the screen glitched. At first, it was just static. A second later, the screen flickered, showing distorted shapes and flashes of text, words that appeared and vanished too quickly to read. I frowned, assuming it was just a weak signal, and then a face appeared. It was human, but wrong. The eyes were too wide, the mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-scream. The skin was pale, stretched too tightly over its skull. It stared directly at me. A low, droning hum filled my speakers, vibrating against my skull. The image flickered, replaced with another distorted face, then another, each one more grotesque than the last. Some had hollow, black eyes. Others had mouths twisted into unnatural, gaping expressions. Then the text returned. "You are ill." The message held for a few seconds before blinking away. Another face appeared, shifting and morphing like a corrupted file. More text followed. "We will find you." My stomach twisted. This wasn't a normal signal error. My remote trembled in my grip as I tried to change the channel. Nothing happened. The screen flickered again, and this time the words appeared in quick succession. "You are weak. You cannot hide. We are here." The humming sound escalated, warping into something shrill and unnatural. The distorted faces flashed rapidly across the screen, their wide, unblinking eyes fixed on me. My body felt frozen, my breath stuck in my throat. Then, all at once, the screen went black. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the darkened screen. A sharp knock sounded at my front door. I jumped, my pulse hammering in my ears. Who the hell would be at my door at this hour? Slowly, I stood and crept toward the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. I peered through the peephole. No one was there. I turned back toward the television. The screen was back to normal, an infomercial playing as if nothing had happened. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I searched online, trying to make sense of what I had seen. There were rumors. Other people in Wyoming had reported similar incidents. Mysterious television hijackings with strange messages, eerie faces, and an unbearable humming noise. No station ever claimed responsibility. No explanation was ever given. Determined to find answers, I posted about my experience on an online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena. Hours passed before I received a response. A user, anonymous except for a string of numbers, replied, "You saw it. They know now." A chill ran through me. I clicked on the user's profile. No posts, no history, just the message. That night, I kept my television off, but the unease stayed with me. At around 2 a.m., my landline rang. I hesitated before picking it up. Silence. Then, just beneath the static, I heard it. The hum. A soft, almost mechanical vibration. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. I wasn't imagining this. The next few days were restless. I avoided my television, refusing to turn it on. But on the fourth night, curiosity got the better of me. I powered it up. The moment the screen flickered to life, the hum returned. The channel I had left it on the night of the incident was playing its usual programming, but I could hear the faint, insistent humming underneath. It wasn't a part of the show. It was coming from somewhere else. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Then, without warning, the screen glitched. The faces were back. "You can hear us. We are closer. Look outside." My breath caught in my chest. No. Slowly, I turned to my window, hesitating before peeling back the curtain. A figure stood on the sidewalk outside my house, just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Too far to make out its features, but I knew it was looking at me. I didn't sleep that night. I don't sleep much anymore. I never saw the broadcast again, but some nights when I'm alone and flipping through channels, I hesitate when I reach static. Because sometimes, just for a second, I think I see those faces staring back at me. And sometimes, when I lay in bed at night, I hear a hum.
The sun was sinking below the horizon when I pulled into the gas station just off the highway. The Arizona desert stretched out in every direction, vast and empty, the heat still radiating from the asphalt. I was heading home after visiting my parents in Tucson, eager to make good time before nightfall. I was the only one at the station, except for the attendant inside the small store. As I filled my tank, I noticed an old, rusted pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot. At first, I thought it was abandoned, but then I saw the man. He was slumped against the side of the truck, his clothes tattered, his skin sunburnt and cracked. His lips moved soundlessly, as if he were whispering something. I hesitated, debating whether to check on him. Something about him unsettled me, but I couldn't just leave him there. I approached cautiously. "Sir, are you all right?" He lifted his head slowly, and I sucked in a sharp breath. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils unfocused. Up close, I could hear him whispering, just a faint, dry rasp. They don't like the lights," he said. I frowned. "Who doesn't?" His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, a flicker of clarity passed through them. "They follow you in the dark," he murmured. "They hide between the stations." I shivered despite the lingering desert heat. "Do you need help? I can call someone." He shook his head violently, then winced as if the motion hurt. No time, just listen." He reached out suddenly, clutching my wrist with a surprising strength. "Don't drive with the radio off," he whispered, his grip tightening. "They move through the silence. They listen, and they find you." A sharp beep from the gas pump made me jump. The man released me, slumping back against the truck, his breath shallow. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned toward the store, intending to call for help, but when I looked back at the truck, he was gone. The driver's side door was shut. The cab was empty. The lot was silent, the desert stretching endlessly beyond. I stood frozen for a long moment, then forced myself to move. I paid the attendant, who barely looked up from his magazine, and got back in my car. As I pulled onto the highway, my fingers hovered over the radio dial. I hesitated. Then, slowly, I turned the radio on. The station crackled with static before settling on an old country song. I exhaled, gripping the wheel tighter. Just a crazy drifter, I told myself. Just the desert playing tricks. But as the miles stretched on, the static grew louder. The song faded, replaced by empty white noise. My hands went clammy against the wheel. I reached for the dial to change the station. A whisper slid through the speakers. "They found you." The car lurched as I swerved, my heart slamming against my ribs. The radio crackled, more whispers spilling through, layered, indistinct, rising and falling like a breath. I fumbled, twisting the dial frantically, but the static only deepened. The words tangled together, overlapping, urgent. "Don't stop. Don't turn around. Keep the lights on." The rearview mirror showed only darkness. My foot pressed harder on the gas. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. Then the headlights flickered, and the whispers turned into screams. A sharp wind hit the car, rattling the windows. I gripped the wheel tightly as a dense fog seemed to rise from the asphalt, swirling in unnatural patterns. The radio static warped, shifting into something like distorted laughter. My vision blurred. Shapes moved at the edges of the road. Shadowy figures, tall and thin, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. They weren't running, they're drifting, gliding forward without moving their legs. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The laughter in the radio deepened, layered with those same whispering voices. They knew I could hear them now. "Faster," one of them murmured. "Not much time." The fog thickened, swallowing the road behind me. My chest tightened. I knew if I stopped, I wouldn't leave this desert. A flicker of light ahead. A gas station. I didn't think. I yanked the wheel, skidding into the lot. The headlights illuminated the front of the station, the neon open sign flickering against the darkness. I threw the car into park, my hands shaking as I turned the engine off. The static stopped. I sat there, gripping the wheel. My breath ragged. The figures were gone. I stepped out of the car slowly, scanning the empty highway behind me. No fog, no shadows, just the open road and the quiet hum of the gas station lights. The attendant, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap, looked up from behind the counter as I stumbled inside. "Rough night?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "You could say that." I bought a coffee, sitting in the station for nearly an hour before I dared get back on the road. The radio stayed on the entire time, and I never drove in silence again.
I never expected to stumble upon something that shouldn't exist. But in the summer of 1963, that's exactly what happened. I was just a teenager living in rural Pennsylvania. My dad had brought home an old black and white television set from a friend who worked at a repair shop. It wasn't much, but it worked well enough for me to watch late-night sci-fi shows when everyone else had gone to bed. One night, I was flipping through the few channels we could pick up, twisting the dial slowly, trying to find something besides the usual reruns. That's when I landed on channel 37. It shouldn't have been there. I had never seen it before. At first, it was just static, a faint hum coming from the speakers. I figured it was a dead signal until the screen flickered. A face appeared. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was human, but distorted. The eyes were too large, the mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-scream. The image wavered, lines of static cutting through it, but I could tell it was looking straight at me. Then the text appeared. "You are watching." I sat there, frozen, my hand hovering over the dial. I should have turned the TV off. I should have run and woken my dad. But I didn't. I just stared as the image changed again. More faces. More wrong faces. Some of them looked like old news anchors, but their mouths weren't moving right. Their voices came through in bursts of garbled static, a low, droning hum layered beneath them. The text flickered again, "We see you." My breath hitched. I turned the dial, trying to change the channel, but the knob wouldn't budge. The screen flashed again, and this time I saw something that sent ice through my veins. A symbol. It wasn't a number or a letter. It looked alien, like something out of a sci-fi movie, except it wasn't fiction. It was real. And it was on my screen. Then the sound changed. The hum turned into a tone. A single high-pitched note that made my skull ache. My vision blurred, and for a second, I swore the edges of the screen warped, bending inward like the TV itself was twisting reality. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, but suddenly the screen went black. Just static. My fingers finally worked, and I twisted the dial furiously, flipping through channels, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. I hadn't. The next morning, I asked around. My dad, my friends, no one had ever heard of Channel 37. When I checked again that night, it was gone. Just pure static, like it had never existed. But I knew what I had seen. Years later, I read about the Channel 37 conspiracy, that the government shut it down to protect astronomy research. That's the official story. But I know the truth. They weren't protecting science, they were protecting us. Because sometimes late at night, when I'm flipping through channels on my modern TV, I swear, just for a second, I see that face. And I hear the tone.